Welcome to today's webinar on Accelerate AI-Driven Application Modernization. I am Dustin Froyam, one of the co-founders of VirtualZ, and I have Vince Ray, our co-founder and Chief Technology Officer, co-presenting with me today. Good morning, Vince.
Good morning, Dusty. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Good.
We're back at it again.
Yeah, we've got to stop meeting this way.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So Vince, I think we're going to start with Propels and kind of talking about getting data to AI platforms, whether that's for modernization or any other AI purpose. But we'll focus on modernization today, and then we'll talk a little bit about Lozen, application modernization made easy, some of our use cases around that, or getting those into really the dawning of the age of automatic code rewrites or code refactoring. We're seeing an explosion of that, and how we can help play in that process. And then we'll just talk really briefly about real-time on-demand data access to real AI platforms as well, and how Lozen enables that. And then we'll have a little time for Q&A. So this will be probably a quick one today, but so let's get started. Vince, on Propels, let's just talk, we have a lot of other webinars about kind of the core of Propels, but let's just talk really briefly about that. And then, how that enables, getting data into AI platforms for modernization purposes.
Yeah, and that's a really common use case. I mean, most organizations that run mainframes have, just massive amounts of commercial business data sitting in, God knows what kind of form on their mainframe. So, they see this kind of emerging world of AI, and they realize that there's business value to leveraging the technology, and they start to dig into it. And one of the things they commonly bump into is, yeah, I want to do that, but it turns out that a lot of the data that I need is sitting there locked away in some vsam file on my mainframe. And that's where tools like Propels can be very, very handy for you. We have the ability to take just about any type of mainframe data and put it really anywhere. But for today's talk specifically, things like Snowflake or Databricks that are pretty common in the in the AI universe. And now suddenly you don't have to spend, I don't know, 20% of your budget trying to figure out, how do I get my really cool data that's sitting on the mainframe? How do I get it somewhere else? I just run Propels and there it is. It becomes kind of a no-brainer. And now that you have access to all of that data, you can do whatever creative things you want to do with it in the AI space. So by taking away that obstacle of, how do I get my data into whatever AI applications I'm trying to use, that's an enormous amount of value. And the other side of this too is that in a lot of cases, yes, that data is on the mainframe and it's amazing in terms of its scalability and performance and how well managed and secured, and all of that is absolutely true. It's been true for decades. But at the same time, when you start trying to unlock that data and do other things with it that you never intended in the first place, you start running into all kinds of secondary problems like skill issues. Just, who can do that? If you have to go out and hire a, I don't know, a COBOL programmer, or someone with vsam deep expertise on your mainframe, that might take you days, weeks, months, God knows how long that could take you to do. So having something that you don't even need particularly deep mainframe skill to use something like Propels. Just, you got to know where your data is, and you got to know where you want it, but Propels pretty much handles the rest of it for you. So it's a major force multiplier in, especially as people race to AI. A lot of organizations of people who know, AI and all the related technologies inside out, but they may not really know much about how do I get data out of my mainframe. And that's where we can help.
And Vince, I think I've heard kind of two primary patterns around, um, the data when they're doing an application modernization using one of these AI code generation platforms. So one is that I think they're shipping the data out, periodically. So maybe doing periodic updates daily, weekly, or something into their um, really their development or modernization platform that they're working with, so that they have kind of currency around that. And then also, making sure that they have the final cutover data fully populated into their target database. Is that right? Is that what you've heard, or am I missing any other kind of key use cases when they're doing an application modernization using Propels?
Yeah, no, I think you're generally correct. I think the one that a lot of folks gloss over, though, is, oftentimes it's not just a one-off. It's not
Yeah.
like I have to get this data moved and I'm kind of done with it. I can move on. It's there. There's a whole life cycle there. Data changes. You might, for nothing to do with AI, you might have a business need to add a couple of new fields to that data. So now it's not just figure out how to get it where it needs to go. It's also figure out how to keep it up to date, not just in terms of content, but in terms of structure over a long period of time. And that's where the true cost of a lot of these systems comes up. Many people kind of wade into this space and they assume, oh, I'll just write a little bit of code. I'll write, use some, you know, web service based thing and, drive an API on my mainframe and, go get some data. And they never really think about, well, what happens if the nature of that data changes a little bit and now either its structure is a little different or the way you navigate through it's a little different. What you're creating is kind of an ongoing expense and, something that has to be kept up to date and tested and, on and on and on that way. So, it becomes a full-time job pretty quickly if you're not careful about it. But certainly to get started, a lot of folks think in terms of snapshots. Go get me a usable copy of the data. I'll go develop my application or migrate my application, wherever I'm trying to do. Um, that might be important to have, but and certainly we can do that with our Propels products. But just as importantly, just like it's easy to get started, Propels makes it really easy to adapt to changes too. As you make changes to your data, Propels deals with that. You don't have to, kind of rethink anything or, God forbid, write code to do any of that stuff. Propels is a zero code solution. So, you might say, oh, I added a field to my data and here's where I want it to go. Or it might be that you're using, I don't know, Postgres today and you want to use Snowflake tomorrow. You Sure, those kind of things happen, but it's just parameters into Propels is all you're really talking there. That's not go hire a team of people and make it happen for 6 weeks. So yeah, I think all of that gets to be kind of important. It's not, and again, you're trying to solve maybe an AI problem, and that's probably where your focus is. So it's easy to overlook some of these longer term requirements, and that's I think an important part of the message we want to get out.
So Vince, I'm going to sneak in one other. It's really a consequence of application modernization, whether you use AI or you're hand coding or whatever model you're using to modernize your application. And we hear this one quite frequently. So they'll modernize the application, they'll replatform it, but they they may have years, maybe even decades of mainframe data, particularly on tape, right? Whether that's virtual tape or actual physical tape. And so, Vince, can you just talk really briefly about how Propels solves that problem too for the customer? And even if they're in a hybrid model, right? They may be splitting the world between mainframe and having some cloud and distributed applications that would need access to that data going forward.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're spot on. I think tape creates kind of a unique cost and operational problem for a lot of sites today. And back in the day, if you had massive amounts of data that you needed to keep indefinitely, tape was a logical way to do that. The density of what you could fit in a virtual tape library was just enormous. Today, not so much. And there are really a couple of problems there. One is to really have that tape data truly resilient, so fault tolerant, and and I recall an event from my background where my company was engaged in defending itself from on a lawsuit, and we needed some data that happened to be on a tape, and the tape was 6 or 7 years old at that point. And we were able to put our hands on the tape, and don't you know, as we spun through it, it was old and brittle enough that sections of the tape weren't readable. So, how do you deal with that? You have multiple copies of the tape. You have, maybe it's not physical tape. Maybe it's virtual tape that's on disk. Maybe that's all replicated. All of these solutions I'm talking about add cost, complexity, day-to-day management that has to go on with them. So, one of the things that we've discussed with a number of customers regarding, how do you get out of that mold with a tool like Propels is that, we can take that data, and it doesn't matter whether you have, a handful of tapes or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tapes. We can take that and put it somewhere else. And, the somewhere else is relatively open-ended. I mean, you might decide to put it on I don't know, a SAN environment right in your own data center. You might go to the cloud with it. You might go to something like Amazon Glacier with it for low cost. I mean, there are many, many options. And, one of the beautiful things about Propels is you don't have to be limited to even one of those. You might say, this kind of data goes here, this kind of data goes here, this kind of data goes here. And one of the little magical things that happens when you do that is that depending what you choose as a target, that data can suddenly be um, usable in whole new ways. You don't have to. I mean, a lot of that data is kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's forgotten about. You need it for whatever business reasons, but when you start dealing with it in Propel, suddenly it's in places where you might be able to get value out of it. Maybe those transaction histories from 5 years ago make for an interesting way to populate your AI models. Maybe there's behavior in there that you'd like to be able to understand better. But today it's just too hard because you have this. You probably don't even know where that data is. You'd have to go on, sometimes call it an archaeology expedition, where you have to hunt down the data before you can even start doing anything with it. With Propels, it's going to be right in front of you, and it's going to be, the easiest place for you to use it. So, you want to use modern tools, you want to use, I don't know, Copilot or something like that. Here's my data. Let me ingest it and just start asking questions. I mean, that suddenly is possible, not just for that kind of live operational data, but for all that historical data too. So it's valuable from many fronts. I mean, it just might be a huge cost savings from, even if you're not doing that stuff. But, definitely if you're, going down that path into AI and, advanced analytics and all that stuff, these are good ways to leverage data that would otherwise be very difficult to leverage.
So Vince, if they're converting their tape data, right, and let's say they want to go to the cloud, they can, so for the data that would be retrievable by the mainframe, we can store that in a blob, right?
Yep.
And then for the data that needs to be in the relational database accessible to the, the AI platform in the cloud, we can put that into rows and columns, that same set of data, really having it accessible in two ways. Is that right?
Yeah, and in between, you can also do significant filtering. I mean, you might not want, you might
Yeah.
use that blob format you described as kind of just a raw backup. It's bit for bit, everything and that was on the tape is now in the cloud. But if you're going to do, I don't know, analytics or some other processing with it, maybe you only need a handful of those records. Maybe you want to filter them and you want to transform them into a row and column format. And even within that, you might have, I don't know, names and addresses and social security numbers and, God knows what in that data. You might decide, for what I need, I don't really need the names and social security numbers. I just need some kind of, behavioral information. What'd you do and how'd you do it? So that and Propel supports all of the above, and of course you can have different subsets of that data in different places. If I'm just looking to do a cheaper alternative than virtual tape, I'm probably just going to go to whatever lowest cost cloud environment is. If I'm dealing with data that's going to go into an AI application, I might choose something a little more capable than that, go up the food chain for something like that. And different tools. You might have an analytics tool that requires input in you know Microsoft SQL Server, let's say. That is a really important point, though, that you put the data where you're going to get the most value out of it. And the way you think about migrating a tape library to the cloud to cut costs, that might lead you to one solution. The way you think about getting that data into, I don't know, whatever your favorite AI platform is, might point you to something completely different than that. And one of the nice things about Propels is we're agnostic. We don't care. As you show on your slide here, we can go just about anywhere. Variety of different databases, probably about 100 different targets that we can support. So yeah, that not having to think through that and kind of imagine if you had to write different code for each target that way. I mean, that would be huge expense over time to try and keep up with that.
Awesome. So that's a perfect segue into the cost discussion. So all of those use cases that we talked about, they're kind of supported right out of the box with Propels. It's unlimited use for $50,000 per enterprise. So there's no install limits, data limits. That's literally $50,000 a year for any company. And that does ship with 5 drivers optimized, pre-configured, SQL, MySQL, Oracle, Snowflake, and Postgres. We can obviously test and optimize additional drivers for you if you wish us to do that for a small uplift. Usually that's about $5,000 to $10,000, not a huge amount of money. But then you get to actually the best the best driver available and tested by us, and then we'll package those into our distribution going forward. All right, so Vince, let's talk a little bit about a different use case, like Lozen. So can you talk a little bit about why Lozen is different and how that supports application modernization?
Yeah, sure. So it really just comes down to two different things. One is that, as we described with Propels is a replication approach. You're taking your mainframe data in whatever format, transforming it, and then storing it somewhere else in whatever that format is. With Lozen, it's the opposite of that. Lozen, the data stays where it is, and we provide real-time networked access to that data from just about anywhere. So with Lozen, there's one source of the truth. If you got data on, we were talking about transactional data sitting in VSAM files. If you got applications that need that data to stay there, Lozen can make it available really anywhere you need it without creating replicas. And the reason that's important is that as soon as you create a replica, it's hard to guarantee that you're getting access to the most up-to-date real-time information. You don't know if, while you were moving that data somewhere else, maybe a transaction came along and updated part of it while you were analyzing it. With Lozen, you have full integrity of that data. If you read a record, you know for sure that it's the most up-to-date record. And where that's really even more important than reading the data is if you have kind of use cases where you're updating that information. A lot of sites will replicate data from the mainframe outwards. They'll run applications against that might do some updates, and then they have this really, really hard problem of how do I get those updates back to my mainframe? And again, you don't know for sure that while you were doing things, maybe some other mainframe application came along and updated that same data. So you can't just kind of blindly overlay it. You can't just kind of blindly say, okay, I'm done with my updates. Let me copy it back to the mainframe, because you might lose changes that way. So, we've seen a lot of customers design these, Rube Goldberg type environments where there are all sorts of complicated schemes to get, especially in the case of updates, to get updated information back to the mainframe. Lozen avoids all of that because there aren't two copies of the data. There's just one copy of the data, and it stays on the mainframe. So that's probably the biggest difference. The other difference is a little more subtle than that. The other difference is that Lozen is all about file orientation and file I/O semantics when you think about accessing the data. So if I have a COBOL program and I'm taking it, I'm taking it from mainframe, and maybe I'm thinking about migrating that application to the cloud, and I'm going to use a technology like like Micro Focus COBOL, or any of the tools that might be out there for that. uh, I want to preserve that logic. So if that COBOL program is opening the file and then doing file I/O semantics, read, write, open, close, that kind of stuff, then I need a system that can support that from off of the mainframe. And the problem is, on the mainframe, things like VSAM are really complicated. It's not just open, close, read, write. It's, find me a record by its key, or insert a record in the middle of a file, or, all of these other things that VSAM can do. So, this is the other difference between Lozen and Propels. Propels, the target is typically going to be some type of database. It's going to be relational, non-relational, no SQL. I don't really care about that, but you're going to use database facilities to access that data. You're going to do SQL queries, not open, close, read, write. Sometimes that's not what you want. Sometimes you're trying to take that mainframe logic, run it somewhere else, and you don't want to have to rewrite all of that into SQL queries. So Lozen allows this idea that the way that mainframe data looks that's being shared through Lozen is going to look like a file. It's a networked file type of an access. So those are really the two differences. And with Lozen, as you're showing on the slide here, what and again is a little bit different about VirtualZ than some of our competitors. We don't say here's a proprietary API to access your data, go to it. Our approach is the right answer is whatever is easiest for the application. So, I mentioned Micro Focus, COBOL, and their enterprise server product, which I guess is Rocket these days. Uh, if that's what the environment you're living in, you don't want to change a line of code in your application. You just want to be able to run it and know that it's going to work properly, have all the same capabilities it's always had, and continue to reference the same data that it's always referenced. So, in that case, what we do is you basically a connector for the microfocus environment that allows us to behave completely cleanly in that environment. Same time, there are a lot of products that are using a standard called Open API. These tend to be I call them integration hubs, but they're basically the ESB or enterprise service bus types of products, MuleSoft or Tibco or Boomi or IBM's products in this space or Microsoft's products in this space. There are many things in this space. So in those environments, we can also give you something that is really drop dead simple to use and just gives you the data the way that's easiest for you to consume it. The case of Mule is a great example. I can install the Lozen Mule connector, and then right inside my Mule development environment, I just kind of drag and drop Lozen object into a workflow, and through nothing more than a little bit of configuration data. What do I want to do? I want to read a record. I want to read a record by its key. Here's the key. And then when that executes, you've done what that visualization expects to do completely, zero code. And again, a lot of these things that are kind of based on that same concept can work the same way through our open API integration. So lots of different ways to get to your data. And again, I wouldn't think of this as a fixed finite list. As customers give us good ideas, we're definitely open to providing more of these types of interfaces. So flexibility in the way you access it, and the real-time read-write access are really the distinguishing features for Lozen.
So Vince, if someone's using a AI-driven refactoring platform like Simbim or Ocean or Mechanical Orchard, how would they connect back into Lozen? What would that architecture look like in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing would just basically be a different type of connector. And what the connector does is it kind of joins those environments you just mentioned to the primitive capabilities of Lozen. Now, we could develop that, or partners could develop that. Probably the customer could develop that as well. There are many ways this can be done. There is at the lowest level in Lozen, the protocols we speak are all industry standard things like NFS. So it makes it pretty straightforward to say, okay, I'm just going to think of that vSAM file on the mainframe that I'm trying to access as just another network drive. A mount point. I open the file. I can do various things with whatever I/O primitives I want to use, and it's going to behave a lot like a network drive would. The only footnote to that is, in addition to all of that, you get all of the uh, uh, advanced capabilities that you find on the mainframe. For instance, I might care about the fact that I'm accessing a vSAM file. I might want to know some metadata about it. How big is it? How big are the records? Does it have keys? If it does have keys, how big are they? Where are they within the record? And, so Lozen exposes all of those capabilities too. All the products you mentioned can leverage that to make, a cleaner interface there. And in a lot of cases, they don't really need any code at all from us on the client side. I mean, we do offer an API that maybe makes that a little bit easier, but um, it doesn't necessarily have to be used that way. It can also be done with just native operating system things on those platforms. So yeah, it should be a very straightforward thing. Assuming the platforms such as the products you mentioned have kind of a basic way of thinking about how to do file I/O, which certainly everybody does.
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot, right? A lot are going from COBOL or PL1 to, a refactor to Java, whether that's hand coded or that's some other um, refactoring platform. So if they're going to Java, I mean, Vince, they can integrate with our Java API in that instance, or they could just make the NFS calls too, right? Using the NFS client. Is that right?
Yeah, well, and I mean, they wouldn't be making NFS calls, they would be making file
Yeah.
system calls, open
Yeah.
what they see as a file. Generally the distinction there really just comes down to how detailed do they need to be. If they expect to do things like, search for a record by its key, position the file there, then read backwards and delete 5 records. If they're looking to do that level of stuff, it's probably easier to use the Lozen API, although you can do it with nothing besides the normal operating system functions. So yeah, I mean, it's a discussion certainly we would have with anyone planning on going down that path, and we would map out the best possible strategy there. Uh, yeah, and by the way, I mean, small footnote, we mentioned the Lozen API. It's not just Java; it's also, we have a version that's basically shared library calls. So, that's suitable for C and C++, and even environments like, Python and Perl and, a bunch of others. Anything that can call, a DLL or a shared library can generally work with our APIs that way. And again, the big advantage is you don't have to know the gory details of how to do these more advanced functions. You just get an API that does it for you, encapsulates that for you, and that's really all you need to know. But yeah, a lot of possibilities there, I suppose.
All right, thanks, Vince. We've answered a lot of questions along the way, but I received a couple other ones. So, can you just talk about the ease of installation and kind of setup and getting running with both Propels and Lozen? I know they're a little different, but yeah, let's just start with Propels.
Yeah, so Propels is about as easy as it gets. We supply the code in a compressed archive form. So really what the install is, restore that archive into a Unix services directory on your mainframe, and it's ready to run at that point. There's no prerequisites other than having a mainframe Java environment, and beyond that, nothing needs to be done. There's no system configuration. There's no settings that need to be changed. You're good to go at that point. If you're using one of those 5 databases you mentioned that we provide, kind of certified out of the box, ready to go, you have no configuration beyond that. I mean, you need to know things like, where's my database, URL that's going to take you to your database. You need to know what type of database it is, names of the tables you want to use, that kind of stuff. But nothing more than that. And the other thing is the way that Propels runs. It's run by an individual user. So you know Dusty logs into the mainframe. Somebody's installed Propels. He types in command line or submits a batch job. It runs as Dusty. So in that case, there's not any special security setup to do. As long as you have security access to the input files you want to process, nothing new needs to be done there. So, Propels is as easy as it gets. And, we've had customers tell us, I can be up and running in 30 minutes. And and even that, after you've kind of seen how it works, and most of that time is going to be reading the documentation and that kind of stuff. So Propels is anybody can do it, and it's as easy as it sounds. I'm not exaggerating at all here. It's a pretty trivial installation experience. Lozen is similar in the structure and so forth, but because of the way Lozen works, it does require some special privileges. We do deep integration with the security products, so that requires certain settings and ability to invoke certain privileged functions in the security system to make sure that a networked client coming into us can be authenticated properly and so forth. So Lozen has a little bit more, and that's the type of thing. It's generally security permissions and that type of stuff. You may, because Lozen is, I think of it as a server application. You may have a couple things to do with your network. Make sure the ports are open, make sure it's secured the way you want it to be secured. You may find yourself generating digital certificates if you want to protect that with TLS, or very customary for really any server type application. But again, it's not like the kind of thing you would spend a week doing. I mean, it 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 is also a very brief install, and you should be able to be up and running in very, very short order. The only exception to that might be the type of mainframe environment where you need permission from 27 different people to do the kinds of things that need to be done. And that's usually just whatever your internal processes require to get the security permissions, for instance, the network permissions and configuration and all of that stuff. But again, still a very very simple thing.
Yeah, so hours and days, not weeks and months, right? And I'll just, for the person asked that question, there's some videos from customers talking about their install and setup experience as well. So you can go check those out at virtualzcomputing.com. Vince, you mentioned Java. Do both of these, are these zip enabled workloads as well?
Yeah, Propels is actually very close to 100% of its CPU consumption is zip eligible. There's a few percent that typically won't be in a lot of client sites. Lozen is similar, also zip enabled, but Usually we see about 90% of the MIPS we consume end up landing on a zip processor. And the reason for that is, certain things that we do just involve, low level ZOS facilities that themselves are not zip eligible. So those types of services that we depend on will, typically not run on the zip. Again, typically it's somewhere between 5 and 15% of the MIPS we use. And of course, it's the customer's choice. There are a few configuration options at the ZOS level. You can decide, if I need zip capacity and the zip is busy doing other things, what do I do? Do I wait for it to be available? Or do I just let that work run on a general purpose processor? Um, so you have some control over that, but most definitely, I mean, zips are a wonderful cost saving device for any mainframe customer. And if you have that need, I mean, that's definitely worth looking at. If you're doing, big time file sharing or lots and lots of propels, you might find that it's worth your while just to invest in a zip engine if you don't have one, or if you're otherwise using them. That usually will pay for itself in short order if you have a big enough workload.
Yeah, I mean, besides, around 90+% being offloaded, there's some other differences that make, both using Lozen and Propel's really efficient, and you can check those out on our blogs as well. All right, any final questions? All right. So I just mentioned the blog. We've got a ton of other resources, demos on demand. Obviously, you can eval either of these products for no cost. We have a ton of additional webinars coming up. And then we have a very large library of webinars in the past. So you can get into some of the efficiency. We have a webinar talks a little bit about the very discrete access that Lozen provides from AI platforms like Watson X and stuff like that, if that's of interest. So, we have a lot of resources out there for you. Check us out on social media as well. And otherwise, have a great day, and we'll catch you on a future webinar. Thanks.